Spoštovano občinstvo, lepo pozdravljeni na današnjem večeru, ki je tudi osrednja debata letošnjega festivalskega fokusa, naslovljenega Prišleki. Ne bom dolgo govorila danes, kot se je že velikokrat v zgodovini pokazalo, je neracionalni strah v veliki meri prav socialni konstrukt. In želim si, da bi z nocojšnjo debato, z nocojšnjimi gosti, tudi ob vašem morebitnem sodelovanju, ki bo zelo dobrodošlo, nekaj tega neracionalnega strahu uspeli demistificirati, razbiti. Na kratko bom predstavila nocojšnje goste. Igor Štiks je kot moderator in gost nocojšnje debate, hrvaški pisatelj in esejist, doktor političnih znanosti, že več let je raziskovalec na univerzi v Edinburgu, in je tudi soorganizator odmevnega Subversiv festivala v Zagrebu in tudi odprte univerze v Sarajevu. Jean-Claude Milner je francoski filozof in esejist, prvič gostuje v Sloveniji, sploh je eden najvidnejših predstavnikov Lacanove šole, v zadnjih letih je znan tudi po svojih publicističnih tekstih, po svojih esejih o antisemitizmu v evropski zgodovini in kulturi in je tudi zelo aktualen mislec družbeno-politične realnosti. Srećko Horvat, hrvaški filozof, publicist, aktivist, avtor več knjig, med drugim tudi v številne jezike prevedenega dela Što Evropa želi, ki je nastalo v soavtorstvu s Slavojem Žižkom, je tudi soustanovitelj in vodja priznanega hrvaškega Subversiv festivala, pa tudi filozofskih večerov v hrvaškem narodnem gledališču. Vermeersch je flamski esejist, profesor politologije na univerzi v Levnu, v bližini Bruslja, nekakšen specialist za srednjo in vzhodno Evropo, veliko je potoval po teh krajih, veliko pisal. Za letošnji festivalski fokus je napisal esej Nočni popotniki, ki je objavljen na več spletnih straneh. Tele brošure so vas pa danes pričakale tudi tukaj v klubu Cankarjevega doma, tako da kdor eseja še ni prebral, si ga lahko odnese danes domov. Alenka Zupančič je filozofinja Ljubljanske psihoanalitske šole, doktorirala je pri Alanu Badiouju, je avtorica številnih prevedenih monografij, prodorna komentatorka slovenske in evropske družbe in Teofil Pančić, srbski esejist, publicist, novinar, kolumnist. V žepni beletrini ob festivalu je izšla njegova esejistično-potopisna knjiga Aleja Viktorja Bubnja, ki jo bomo v četrtek 3. marca tudi predstavljali ob 18. v knjigarni Modrijan. Besedo predajam Igorju Štiksu in želim uspešno debato.
Thank you, Renata. When Renata invited me to this panel, I said, wow, I mean, I definitely want to participate, but I definitely do not envy the guy who is going to moderate. And I said, but we actually thought about you. And of course, clearly I'm going to do it, thanks to Renata's power of conviction. So she basically persuaded me to do it, and we'll see what will happen tonight, whether we are going to demystify or even further mystify the current situation. However, I will try to give an introduction to this evening by focusing on a couple of elements that might inform our discussion. The year 2015 and the beginning of 2016, we could say, are the years of burning all or many illusions we had. Certainly in Europe and in the EU, it was first, at least for me, the Greek crisis of this summer that definitely burned the illusion that there is a possibility of democratic opposition to the austerity measures championed by the EU. We saw the Greek spring lasting very shortly and being crushed by imposed decision by unelected bodies of the EU. Many of us were then quite disappointed in the EU as such, and many are even turning against the EU as a project. The second shock came with the refugee waves that many of us convinced that Europe and the European Union lacked any sort of humanitarianism or any sort of humanitarian approach or solidarity to these people. The multiplication of the barbed wires and the erection of borders killed the idea of a borderless, open and free Europe. Finally, there were terrorist attacks in Paris, to which the response was even further securitization. So many illusions are definitely burned in the year 2015. In his last published text, one of the greatest Slovenian poets and intellectuals, Aleš Debeljak, in Delo, wrote on the 9th of January, wrote about tears in Europe. And tears appears, he writes, when emotions overwhelm us. He quotes Beckett, who said, "My words are my tears." Aleš adds that the opposite is true as well. Our tears are our words. For Aleš, tears represent the domination of emotions over reason and allow us to turn away from causes towards, as he puts it, internal side of our intimate window. There were so many tears in 2015, Aleš writes. Bitter tears of refugees, persecuted and stateless, patriotic tears of defenders of so-called Christian Europe, mourning tears of the relatives of those killed in terrorist attacks, touching tears of solidarity, sore tears of the border guards. Everything says, Aleš concludes, that these tears tells us something. Tears require a response. He concludes his text with the following words: as long as tears run, the wish for change will remain. It is therefore not at all indifferent what kind of tears run down in Europe. Now, as I said, we are witnessing so-called, of course, under quotes, the return of history, especially in much of the Western Europe. We here in the Balkans experience a lot of that history with a big H. We started to believe that history is happening somewhere else, in the Middle East, or somewhere far away, in Africa. Now it's here. Refugees are here, shootings happen in the streets of Paris. Brussels was closed down for 4 days, was basically under military siege. Limitless state of exception is currently imposed in France. Barbarians at the Gate is a well-chosen ironic title. Hannibal ante portas. Hannibal, of course, the North African, the Tunisian, we would say, someone that brings these images of being actually besieged. Now, isn't that ironic that Europe and the West, that's been so involved in intervention all around the world, are basically now saying that we are besieged by those that are coming at our gates, though there's a crossing already our gates, no matter how many of them, then we put those that are now, and this is where the panic starts, are even joining the barbarians who are already among us. After all, the perpetrators of the Paris attacks were French citizens coming from Paris, so the barbarians might be already among us. We just don't know who they are. And now they've been joined by the hordes of the others, similar to them. Now, hysterical reaction to newcomers of seeing barbarians absolutely everywhere, it comes with another construct of endangering our way of life. Whatever that is, our way of life becomes quite a frequent motive. How they are endangering our way of life? By being here, by potential intermarriages, by imposition of their culture, of their religion, and tomorrow of their political power. After all, Ulebek published a novel with a similar imaginary this year. Now, there are two things that are becoming sort of battlefields. One is secularism, the other is female body. I'll ask my panelists to respond to that as well. Multiculturalism, as we know it, works insofar as it involved a managed process of the so-called integration of manageable minorities. Since we need them as a workforce, since they are here as a result of decolonization, well, at least we can decide whom to accept and how to govern them, how many of them. Multiculturalism seems to be a hypocritical cover-up word offering a false solution to the so-called diversity. Now, Angela Merkel herself said that multiculturalism is dead a couple of years ago. She's the one who also welcomed many refugees. Now you can see that this is putting a lot of pressure on her policies by those who, as herself, do not believe in multiculturalism as solution and who do not believe that Germany will manage, as she likes to say. The incident in Cologne, in Köln, is very instructive in this respect. We eventually found out that only 3 people out of 58 arrested were refugees. The others were so-called immigrants. Actually, they are not immigrants. They've been there since very long time. They've been living there. Many of them are German citizens. But now the shift clearly focused from the whole hysteria about the refugees that are coming and now imposing their ways and imposing them on women, on our women, is shifting towards the immigrant population in general. Now, what kind of imaginary we have here? This is something we want to discuss. Who are those civilized? Are those civilized those that are representing us now as defenders of women, who didn't allow women to vote and did it only recently? Are those ones who are telling us that there is no necessity for feminism in Western society because the problem is sorted out? Or those ones who defend women against the barbarians? The barbarians, we are of course the civilized one, we are the secular one, although we could be religious in healthy doses, and also we respect women, we allow them to dress as they wish. These days, of course, it wasn't like this always. And the barbarian, on the other hand, is a religious, is zealous, is patriarchal, he simply takes or rapes women, he simply cannot control himself. Now, the story of all the refugees is the same. I've been a refugee, I was a refugee myself, escaping Bosnia in 92 to come to Croatia. It means escaping mortal danger, it means a wish for a decent life, security, basic. It means a wish for a glimpse of a future that you can believe in somewhere else. But what is the problem of the West where they flee? Democracy devoid of meaning, confused intellectuals, social networks paralysis of meaningful social relations, let alone political action, disoriented youth, disaster capitalism, producing poor masses that might revolt and explode at any time, but also we who are left without a clear idea how to change things, how to change and in what direction. In his poem, Waiting for the Barbarians, Konstantin Cavafy sings about Greeks waiting at their gates for barbarians to finally come. The problem was that they did not come. So Greeks go back home disappointed from their city gates. He concludes his poem with the following verses. And now, what's going to happen to us without barbarians? They were, those people, a kind of solution. My answer to the theme of this discussion was to paraphrase Cavafy. What would have happened to us without those barbarians if they didn't come? However, they did come. And now, after all, they offer us a kind of solution. The first is to conclude that nothing will remain the same in Europe. And it's an illusion to think that there is a possibility to go back to the previous moment. The question is, and this is what I'll try to discuss with my colleagues here, is what kind of solutions we are going to have, and whether good or bad, out of this extremely complex situation. So, in order to move towards our discussion, I will now invite the panelists to join me here. So please, I would ask you for a welcoming applause for Jean-Claude Milner, Alenka Zupančič, Srećko Horvat, Teofil Pančić, and Vermeersch. Thank you, Belletrina, and people to invite Peter Vermeersch, whose work I've been following for years and who has been my friend in double capacity of both a fellow writer but also fellow academic. And you have an opportunity to read his wonderful essay, Night Travelers. Now I'll ask Peter to comment on the short statement he sent to the organizers of this panel, in which Peter said, "Common divisions are tragic reductions. A perspective that sees the world as made up of us and them, the civilized and the barbarians, lacks a sense of reality as much as it lacks imagination." So I'd like to ask you now, as a political scientist, to tell us what you actually had in mind, what is the reality, and where do we lack imagination, or is our imagination simply twisted?
Thank you, Igor. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Yes, that's a bit of an enigmatic statement at first sight, right, isn't it? But it's actually something which was very much on my mind when I wrote the essay that you have in your hands. I wanted to write about reality because I was a little bit fed up with the cliches in which we talk about refugees. And with the cliches, I mean the metaphors like waves of refugees, streams of refugees, floods. It's almost like a natural disaster, something happening to us, a flood without rain almost. It's very strange, and I thought, is there another way to write about it? A way that would be more closer to reality. And in fact, when you discover that, for the essay, I went to a refugee asylum center in my hometown in Belgium. You discover that there's a very complex world around of experiences. It's not all the same story. It's variations of human lives, like there are variations of human lives here in this room. And it's very hard to discover them, to describe them in a more general way. So I think the way we should try to talk about refugees and get closer to the reality of it is by making it smaller, making the encounter manageable, and try to bring a bit of that reality into our discussion. And that's what I tried. That's the reality part of it. And I think all sorts of categorizations go beyond it and create a sort of hyper-reality that doesn't necessarily is very well rooted in what is really happening.
It seems to me that here you're constructing basically the big talk, very abstract talk of theories, philosophers, intellectuals, or even media, with actually the reality of concrete situation, concrete human lives, and so on. The problem is how to bridge the two.
Sure, I mean that's certainly a problem, and I think, you know, I've written in my essay also about the generalities of things. You cannot avoid it to a certain extent. But then the moment, I think, is to realize that generalities are never the full picture, they're never the full truth. You have to go and dig in a little bit deeper and see what happens then. And then, of course, you respond in other ways as well. As human beings, you connect to other human beings in a personal way, and that is also more complex. I think, you know, it's to some extent it's natural that we think of our own lives as something given, as something personal, something intimate, and the lives of others as something big, abstract, far away, not very clear, something threatening. It's perhaps our psychological makeup to think of us persons as the main characters in our own movie and as the others as sort of abstract, flat by figures. But you have to go beyond that. And I think in the case of the people on the move in Europe at this point, it's very important that we do that we make that step towards the persons, the individual persons who are there.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting. I ask you to answer as a political scientist, but you're answering the question as a writer. And you know very well that if you put this into political scientist type of text, you will never get published, you'll get fired. So how are you going to manage this?
Thank you for firing me, Igor. Well, now I'll give the political science answer then. No, I think there's another dimension to this whole thing, and that is why do we think in categorizations? I think that's what we are faced with today in Europe, is a lack of political leadership that engages us to think in other ways about this crisis than in this large cliched categorizations. So I think that is missing. And when I was talking about that there's also imagination missing, I think the imagination missing is really the responsibility of the politicians leading us. Because something which will not change is the fact that there is migration. So, for example, closing off borders and things like that, these are all fake solutions to generalized fake problems in a way. The only way to move forward is actually show leadership, which takes responsibility and says, perhaps this is not easy, perhaps this is not something which will benefit us in the first instance, but we have to do it because we agreed on certain principles around human rights and around refugee conventions, around asylum procedures and so on. So we cannot avoid this, we cannot put this aside. We have to take responsibility. And that sort of leadership is lacking. And I think that's when I'm talking about the lack of imagination in my statement, it's the lack of imagination of taking responsibility for a problem that is much more multifaceted than simply some abstract horde of people threatening us in our ways of being.
Well, thank you, Peter, for this first round. I'll move to Jean-Claude Milner, who also brings us quite an enigmatic statement. Jean-Claude Milner says, there are no barbarians, there are only gates or doors. Now, my question for Jean-Claude is, can you tell us who defines the gates? And who are or are supposed to be then gatekeepers? And can you comment on what kind of imaginary, because we were talking a lot about imaginary here already, we are talking in this situation. And now I'm not talking only about those fearing the newcomers, because they have their own imaginary, but also about those welcoming them with a different type of imaginary.
I shall begin by raising a question about the word barbarian and this family of words. You remember that the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, were the inventor of the notion barbarian. And they had a very clear conception. A barbarian was a human being who was, from every respect, identical to a human being, except for one thing. He didn't speak. Because speaking for an ancient Greek meant speaking Greek. And I shall quote, in order to make myself clear, I shall quote Simon and Garfunkel. People are talking without speaking, people are hearing without listening. It seems to me that we have in those two verses by Simon and Garfunkel a definition, a modern definition of what a barbarian is. A barbarian is a being who talks without speaking, but also a being who hears without listening. And from that point of view, I think you begin to understand what I meant by referring to gates and doors. The doors and gates have two sides. And on one side, you have people who hear but do not listen. And for these people who hear but do not listen, the other people talk but do not speak. That means that the door defines barbarian on both sides at the same time. And of course, the reverse movement is true. You have people on one side of the door who are persuaded that on the other side people are hearing them but do not listen. And from that moment they begin to doubt if they themselves are speaking beings rather than talking beings. And in that sense also, doors have two sides, and barbarian have two ways of defining themselves and be defined by others. It's not only a play about words. The fact that people may talk without speaking, and the fact that people may hear without listening, and the fact that when they hear without listening, the speech of the others cease to be speech and begin to become a simple talking sound, and at the end a simple rumor. This double movement is connected with what I call the modern definition of language. It had been clearly articulated both by Freud and by Saussure. This definition is the following: speaking and listening are not the two sides of the same coin. They are in fact inscribed on one continuous surface. It's not a surface with two sides, one side being hearing, being listening, and the other side being speaking, but it's one-sided surface. And of course, you have another continuity, the continuity between talking and speaking, and the continuity between hearing and listening. Once you have broken the continuity between listening and speaking, you have also broken the continuity between talking and speaking, and between hearing and listening. Among the many real situations that cause such a break, there is an element. In French we call it foule, in English maybe crowd, and I oppose it in French to masse, plural, English masses, plural. Crowd, to be part of a crowd is not voluntary. I mean, it may begin as a voluntary decision, but it ends by the instinction, with the instinction of all free will. In a crowd, there is no speaking, there's only talking. In a crowd, there is no listening, there is only hearing. The crowd materializes the breaking up of language. In that sense, the crowd is intrinsically a barbarian structure. Masses, on the other hand, do not break the structure, the modern structure of language, the continuity between listening and speaking, and also the continuity between hearing and listening and talking and speaking. In that sense, masses may become crowds and may become barbarians, barbaric, whatever. but it's not necessarily so. What happened with the Caliphate? The Caliphate has created the Muslims as a crowd. It deprives all Muslims of the status of speaking beings. They are treated as a unitary crowd, a massive crowd, but not masses precisely, a massive crowd whose rallying cry is to kill and to die. The non-Muslims, on the other way, are defined as another crowd, a massive crowd, not masses, but a massive crowd, which has only to submit to one order: to be killed and to die. The European response to that was to create new crowds, that is, the crowd of refugees. They are a crowd from the European point of view. We do not know what language they speak. We do not think that they speak any language. We do not preoccupy ourselves with the language they speak. They are not speaking beings to us. They are only bodies with, at least for humanitarians, some body necessities. They are not speaking beings. And so we do not listen to them. We do not treat them as speaking beings. But by doing so, we do not treat ourselves as speaking beings. So, again, I would say that doors have two sides, gates have two sides, and I would say, I would read my last lines of my original paper. Europeans do not know whether or not the refugees have a language. They do not listen to them, they do not talk to them. By doing so, they have proved themselves to be barbarians. They have deprived others of the faculties that on principle should have made impossible the return of the barbarians. That old word that came from the Greek in a way that in principle could not believe in. But they have deprived themselves of the same faculties. Everywhere a door is shut down, barbarians appear on both sides.
Thank you. Thank you. Clearly barbarians on the both sides of the barbed wire. Now, I'll ask Alenka now to explain what she meant by her statement. Today's worst barbarism is systemic, built into the global social order, and mostly wireless. So if I'm not mistaken, you purposefully contrasted the barbed wires that have been multiplying around us with this wireless, invisible, but very effective barbaric violence.
Yes, thank you. Actually, not so much contrasting them as trying to put them together in some way. So I actually wrote down a couple of points that I would like to make, so I will be reading more or less. But yes, the point was precisely to choose the word wireless for its obvious connotations today in the given context. And of course, I'm not the first to point out that how wirelessness and the wire are actually two sides of one and the same thing. I don't know, call it the functioning of global capitalism. It is as if wire removed in order to enable free circulation of products and of capital would refuse to disappear, but persistently reappears in other places, mostly preventing the movement of people, of course. or as if liberal freedom carried in itself a certain necessary amount of wire as the condition of its smooth and normal everyday functioning. Usually, however, the wire doesn't appear in such a direct, literal form. It rather appears in the form of bureaucratic regulations and supposedly natural impossibilities. And the fact that this time the wire is appearing as precisely the wire has its consequences. It is striking, it shocks our sensibilities, and it provokes all kinds of responses. Nobody wants the wire to appear as the wire. It would be better for the wire to take another less obvious, less sinister form, attracting less attention. At least it would seem so. And if this were indeed the case, there would actually be reasons for celebrating the appearance of wire as wire. We could have said, finally, the mostly invisible constraints regulating our social and economic global reality were forced to appear in full visibility for what they are. Masks are fallen. But I think one should be wary of this celebrating move. For when things appear just as they are, with no pretense in their supposed naked brutality, they usually come with a nasty surplus, as it is clearly the case with the shameless appearance of the wire. The fact that nobody is trying to pretend anything anymore about this should worry us the most, precisely. The dropping of pretenses can be an act of sheer overconfident arrogance, barbarism, a sign of unassailability rather than exposure or sign of weakness. And this brings me to my second point, which is that there is no doubt that the massive arrival of refugees is dramatically changing the face and the heart of Europe. However, it is not that refugees themselves are dramatically changing the face and the heart of Europe. The job is effectively carried out by the reactions to them, by the way we cope and deal with their arrival, by the way we shut the door. Many are afraid that Europe will lose its most precious identity, so they suggest and put up different measures in order to prevent that. Yet, of course, the irony is that these measures themselves are already now, and not in some future, effectively changing this precious European identity. It is becoming something rather spooky. And I'm not talking simply about wires and walls, but rather about all kinds of extremely spooky policies and public debates that are becoming part of our everyday mainstream reality. So Europe will not change in some more or less distant future. It is actively changing now as we speak. And this is related to the first point that I would like to make, which is also interesting in a general, more wider scale, namely that the present moment is clearly the moment in which the European economic crisis is re-emerging or emerging as European political crisis. And this shift is quite spectacular. You know that during the peak of the economic crisis, an enormous effort has been put into preventing precisely the public debate from turning the crisis into a political issue. That is, into the question of a possibly different economic politics. This is why it was so crucial to have the Greeks fail in their efforts, because there was some kind of alternative thinking. So it was imperative that everything remained just the question of proper or better economic management, and not of perhaps alternative politics. But the crisis Europe is facing today with refugees, on the other hand, is clearly set in terms of political crisis, and more or less openly recognized as such. There is the impossibility of a political agreement or of a common European policy on the question of refugees, and there is clearly a heated political debate and divide emerging in all countries affected by the arrival of refugees. And I think this is no coincidence. Removed as it has been from the economic issues by the neoliberal ideology, politics has been reserved almost exclusively for the state regulating different social interactions. This was basically what politics have been called in past decades. And now with the refugees, the kind of long-awaited opportunity has come to efficiently attack and dismantle the state in this sole political point. And to remember that during the crisis, we have already been listening to the mantra about how the state is irrationally giving the money to the poor and unemployed, who, the lazy bastards living on social aid, thus prevent our economy from functioning well. And now exactly the same political agents are full of sympathy for poor and unemployed. The state, they say, is giving all the money to the refugees, while honest working Slovenes or other citizens are hungry. This overnight transformation of lazy bastards into honest, hard-working Slovenes is, of course, an obvious political manipulation, but it works and it has a very efficient side to it. So if we are up to our necks now in a political crisis, we should not make the same or similar mistake as before and forget the economic aspect of this same crisis, this political crisis. For it obviously plays a major part in the rise of right populist politics. Of course, people do have serious problems of their own, and nobody can guarantee them that their social predicament will not further degrade. Yet the crucial point to be repeated again and again is, I think, this. The improvement of their social predicament can be least of all guaranteed by those who are presently taking the stand as their defenders of the poor and needy in national states, and who are the loudest, of course, in the anti-refugee hysteria. Not only because as parties they have no social politics and they're openly neoliberal, but because as political forces they only flourish in the times of crisis and devastation and in hopefully never-ending state of exception. The politicians defending us against the refugee threat, are precisely those who desperately need this very threat in order to carry out their political agenda. So the last thing they really want is for things to calm down, all these refugees to become integrated and everything to run smoothly. So, and I would simply conclude by saying that perhaps we should not allow the whole debate simply slide into the sole question of xenophobia, tolerance and intolerance, racism, into the confrontation between those who have enough intelligence and humanity to perceive migrants as humans similar to us, and those who are who are lacking these qualities. For I think this could be underestimating the problem. We are not far, I think, at least here in more Eastern Europe, from a situation where the word racist will no longer be seen as an insult, but rather as a perverse kind of moral code word, with the accompanying perverse white man's burden narrative, which goes like this: although this is very difficult for us, we need the strength to be racist. We need to take this burden upon ourselves. If we want to save the Christian heart of Europe, we have to hate and kill. And as often in this case, I think what we need most is to be saved from our saviors in this case.
Thank you, Alenka, for bringing us also to the general question of the system we live in and that produces barbarians or civilized and refugees that are of course trying to find their way in this this global disaster. You are also bringing us to the very concrete points. Now, Srećko will take us even further and will speak in more concrete terms about geopolitical context of the refugee crisis. In your statement, Srećko, you said, quoting, "We came, we saw, he died." And then you say, this is not some barbarian saying about killing someone at European doors. This is what Hillary Clinton jokingly said when Gaddafi was killed. So who are the real barbarians? Now, we could read your sentence that you want to include even more clarity in your response and simply say, the barbarians are imperialists. Barbarians are those who are behind it. Are those US imperialists? Are those these people that run the only superpower in the world? Of course, I imagine that your answer to this will be more varied, as the general geopolitical situation cannot be so easily simplified.
So hello, pozdrav svima, thanks for the invitation, and let's go in medias res. I think the problem of the so-called refugee crisis is precisely that it's not being perceived as a crisis of geopolitics, and that the origin of the refugee crisis is precisely geopolitics. So I didn't prepare any speech. I will not speak about humanist ideals. I will not speak about theory today, because I want to tackle some very precise origins of the refugee crisis. The quote you mentioned, you can find it on a YouTube video where you can see Hillary Clinton when she is approached by journalists showing the dead pictures, videos of Gaddafi, where she smiles and says, okay, he is now dead, and it's fun. It's not just a bizarre video. I think it's a warning of the days which will come, and this is the presidency of Hillary Clinton. So on the one hand, either it will be Donald Trump, or on the other hand, it will be Hillary Clinton. And again, it's two parts of the same coin. The problem, of course, is that it will probably be Hillary Clinton. But let's go back. When we speak about the refugee crisis, I think we mainly go into the wrong direction. And also, if we try to find the solution in multiculturalism, or in quotas, or in outsourcing the problem, as the European Union is currently doing by investing 3 billion of euros to Turkey, where you will have new concentration camps on the border of Turkey, I think these are all wrong measures for the refugee crisis. I'll give you an analogy. You probably all heard of Thomas Piketty, the author of the famous Capital in the 21st Century. So the solution of Thomas Piketty's theory, the solution for inequality in global capitalism, is heavy tax, progressive taxation of those 1% who have more wealth than 99%, to put it so simple as that. The problem, of course, with this solution is that you cannot solve a systemic problem, the systemic problem of functioning of capitalism by progressive taxation. It just means actually a cosmetic solution of a problem which is much deeper. And I think the same goes for the refugee crisis. Also, it was very nice to see all the signs of solidarity on the Balkans, where ordinary people helped refugees. I remember very well when the wave of refugees started in the Balkans, which already consists of two mistakes, because first I said wave, and second I said it started. First of all, it's not a wave, it's not a natural disaster, and neither, I mean, to add what Peter said, neither Hurricane Katrina or Haiti were disasters. Although they are perceived as natural disasters, they wouldn't be so disastrous if they didn't hit poor neighborhoods which were already preconditioned to have a disaster like that, such as Haiti or Katrina. So the same goes for the refugee crisis. It's not a natural crisis, it's actually a result of geopolitics. And the second the mistake which I mentioned is that it started. No, it didn't start. What we encountered in the Balkans Balkans, which means more than half a million people moving through the so-called Balkan route, more than 1 million people entering the European Union in the last 6 months. It didn't start now. It is happening in Lampedusa and in Lesbos already for 10 years. So this is also one misconception and one ideology, I would say, which is part of this blurred picture of the so-called refugee crisis. So anyway, when it so-called started in the Balkans, I went to the main railway station in Zagreb, and the taxi drivers were actually trying to steal money from refugees, asking for 500 euros to drive the refugees from the main railway station to the border of Slovenia. So what happened as a result is that ordinary people organized themselves and they were showing solidarity. And this happened in all the Balkan states. In Belgrade, where I'm very often, on the main railway station, also Igor went there to bring clothes, to bring food to the refugees. It happened in Zagreb, in Slovenia. It happens also in the center of the beast, in Germany, in France, and so on. But this, again, is not a solution for the refugee crisis. It's nice to show solidarity, but I think we should go much deeper. Then when we speak about quotas and what is now happening on the level of the European Union, and as a result you will have, as a consequence, you will have soon a Hungarian referendum, then you will have soon a Czech referendum, and soon you will have a Polish referendum, which I think all are symptoms and signs in the direction that something which is called the European Union is dying or is already dead. So if this is not solution, what is the solution? I think precisely the video by Hillary Clinton brings us back to the core of the problem, and the core of the problem are Western interventions in the Middle East. So just during the New Year's Eve, if you didn't have anything better to do, to party or something else, you could read the emails by Hillary Clinton, which were revealed by the State Department, not by Edward Snowden or WikiLeaks, but by the State Department, and you could have seen how the intervention in Libya was being prepared. What is interesting, that's the reason why I'm very skeptical about humanist ideals, is that one French philosopher was present there in Libya, undercover as a journalist and undercover as a philosopher. His name was Bernard-Henri Lévy, of course, and he was actually trying to negotiate and analyzing existing contracts, oil contracts with Western and French companies. So after the intervention in Libya, what do you have? After the intervention in Libya, you have 3 different waves where the arms and the so-called freedom fighters go. One wave goes to Mali, the other wave goes to Niger, and the third wave goes to Syria. So after Libya, of course, you have the intervention in Syria. I'm not claiming that Gaddafi or Assad were good guys, but Syria, before the intervention, I had the luck to be there, was a at least semi-secular country, semi-democratic country, with an influx of tourists per year of 400% per year before the intervention. And then what happened? 2 things happened. The first was that they found out that Syria lies on extreme resources of natural gas. And the second, which is also a problem, is of course that Syria didn't owe a penny to the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. So of course then you have the refugee crisis and more than 4 million people fleeing to Europe, and no one poses a question, why are these people fleeing? Is it a natural disaster? Is it just wave of refugees? Or do we have blood on our hands? Are they fleeing maybe because of our Western interventions? So to end, I mean, we can continue this discussion for hours, and of course I'm simplifying the geopolitical situation, but I think this situation won't be solved. What we have seen with the terrorist attacks in France and the reactions by France or by the UK government is that the European Union is actually approaching something what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben in his last book calls stasis, which is a term from ancient Greece which describes an internal war in the city itself. In Greece, it was in the 4th century BC, a war between the oligarchy and the democratic forces. What we can see today is precisely actually the same. So the reaction of David Cameron to the Paris attacks was to employ 10,000 troops on the streets of UK. And he explicitly said we are trying to diminish the difference between police and army. So what you have in Europe actually is that we are currently approaching a civil war. As a reaction, what Europe is doing, and you could have seen it only 2 weeks ago if you are following the releases of WikiLeaks, is that Europe is answering to the refugee crisis on the one hand by outsourcing the problem to Turkey, investing a lot of money trying to outsource this in the way that all the refugees will stop at the Turkish border and they will go to some kind of modern concentration camps with IKEA furniture, which is not a joke because UN ordered 10,000 shelters by IKEA very recently. And the second is something what WikiLeaks revealed. It is called Operation Sophia. I don't know if you knew about it, but I think this will also change the geopolitical picture of the European Union already in several months. So this is the operation which consists of two things. The first phase is a phase of military action in high seas, trying to stop the boats of refugees which are trying to come to Europe. This is deployed by Frontex. And this is still not the end, because the problem lies again in Libyan territorial waters. So what the European Union now is trying to do is not only to stop boats in high seas, but they are trying to come to Libyan territorial waters. Why is this important? It is important because they cannot come to Libyan territorial waters. Why can't they come to Libyan territorial waters? Because there is no fucking government in Libya. Why there is no fucking government in Libya? Because we made all the preconditions that there is no government in Libya. Because you have tribes and different troops fighting against each other and so on. So what the European Union is now trying to do, and it's already happening, like several weeks ago, John Kerry, the Secretary of State of US, was in Rome, saying that in Libya you have 5,000 ISIS groups, so the answer should be a military action in Libya. So at the moment, as we speak, Libya is being bombarded again. You have UK, French, and US troops in Libya. Why? Is it because of the refugee crisis and because we cannot stop the refugee boats in territorial waters in Libya? No. It's again the same old story, because if you don't have a government of national unity in Libya, then you don't have one political subjectivity, one political actor with whom you can develop further the oil contracts and so on. So this is just one example how European Union is trying to handle the refugee crisis. And what I'm trying to say is that all our discussions on multiculturalism, humanism and so on won't unfortunately bring us closer to the solution of the refugee crisis. The solution is not integration, the solution is not multiculturalism, the solution is actually to face the geopolitical reality which is happening in front of our eyes, and we are not facing it. So instead of speaking about quotas, instead of speaking about investing money into Turkey and so on, what we should be speaking about is that Europe, step by step, by all these fences, by new referendums, by confiscation of assets in Scandinavian countries or in Switzerland, by the abandonment of Schengen, Dublin and so on, is actually we are facing a new geopolitical scenario where Europe is actually becoming a fortress, where the refugee flows will be stopped in Turkey, where at the same time in Syria you already have a planned depopulation. There will be no population in Syria. So what we can expect actually, if we follow closely this situation, is that very soon we might also expect an intervention from Turkey to Syria. So what is happening already in Turkey, where you finally again can see the cynicism of the European Union, and that this continent is, that this community called European Union is dying, is that the European Union is investing 3 billion euros to someone who is imprisoning journalists, academics, to someone this someone is called Erdogan, to someone who is leading a brutal, bloody civil war towards the Kurds in the territory of Turkey as we speak, not on the borders, only in some other countries. So maybe it's better that I stop here because I could go further. But I don't think that we have a solution for the refugee crisis. And I think what European Union is approaching in 2016 is war.
Yes, so now I'll come, of course, to the final panelist, who is the only non-EU speaker here. I said I could join you with my other passport, so just to make you more comfortable with all these EU citizens. I would like to ask you something else. Srećko, in July 2013, the great day came, Croatia joined the European Union. Srećko, and with one of his friends, actually one of his beloved friends, wrote an article in The Guardian and basically wanted to spoil the party. While there were wonderful, magnificent celebration in Zagreb, that Croatia finally joined the Europe and the civilized world and get herself out of the barbaric Balkans, he was writing that actually, basically, you know, Croats, you have nothing to celebrate about, you just passed one gate out of many gates in the EU. You didn't join the EU as you think, you basically joined the EU periphery. And like in Kafkaesque stories, once you pass one gate, there's another gate, and there's another gatekeeper waiting for you, even within the EU. Now, you, Teofil, you come from Serbia, that been camping on the doors of EU for quite some time, that been also having a very pro-European government, actually in place. And I would like to hear how you see this situation coming from countries that been sandwiched between these civilized and the barbarians.
You know, that means to be the other. That's how they colonize you. Picture this. He asked all the participants here about their general view about immigration, Europe, Arabs, Asia, and so on and so on. And he asked me about Serbia, because of course I'm only here to speak about Serbia. What else do I know? I'm not even an EU citizen.
So you give the voice to the barbarian and then they start to complain.
I will not do that. I will not do that. Of course, I will talk about that, but later.
After the panel.
Yeah. First, you asked everybody, so asked me too, about that sentence.
Ah, yes. Oh, yeah. No, thank you for reminding me. I'm not doing my job very well. Because this is also quite an enigmatic sentence. Only civilized people, as Teofil says, consider themselves and their societies barbarian. For me, this speaks a bit about what Jean-Claude Milner was saying about turning yourself into barbarian.
Yes. Of course, I wrote that sentence because the organizers of this discussion asked me to give them some sentence. So I gave them a sentence. And now I have to pull it with the meaning. Well, I'll try. I was actually thinking about the thing that I would call, I don't know, something like self-reflection, you know, when an individual or society think about themselves, who they are, what they do, is it okay, is it wrong, and so on and so on. That is self-reflection. But actually, this kind of systematic self-reflection to the borders and across the borders of self-flagellation is actually a luxury of wealthy, free, and educated people who are mostly living in the countries of Western and Central Europe and Northern America. So that's why they so oftenly think about themselves or their governments barbarian and their acts barbarian. So of course it doesn't mean that their acts are not barbarian. It's just that, you know, the lack of that self-reflection is usually just a lack of a chance to develop that kind of self-reflection. What I'm about to say about that ardor, about that barbarian, is something about the image of the barbarian. No, not barbarian, that's wrong. About the other, you know, with the capital O. In Europe, who is that other who is coming from Middle East or somewhere else? In the imagination of the right-wingers, of fascists, of xenophobes, that other is some dirty Muslim who is going to rape our women and, you know, is going to, I don't know, we will not be able to eat pork or something. So what the fascist is saying is, you are different, and that is wrong. On the other hand, there is a sort of leftists who are, well, the believers of multiculturalism. And they are kind of, ritualizing that difference of that other. And they think it's something as a value itself. You are different, and that is great. And that guy or girl who is, you know, taught to be different by the fascists who think this is wrong to be different, and by the leftist liberal who think it's so great to be different, is just listening to that and said, and he or she says, "Fuck you! I'm not different. I'm not different, and it's perfectly irrelevant. Do you like me or hate me because of my otherness? Because I'm not other at all in that sense that you think that I am, and I don't want to be." There is I guess that more or less all of you have seen this wonderful Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian, when the guy, some kind of a preacher, he talks in front of the audience of some crowd, and he says, "You're all different," and one guy says, "I'm not." Well, that guy who is not different is basically a person whom I've seen in the streets of Belgrade and other our cities during the peak of so-called immigrants crisis. I saw lots of people who are simply ordinary, mostly young people, urban, whatever that means, and without any valuing of that word, who simply want to escape the war and, of course, to live a better life. And what they actually want is to become the part of the system with the capital S. They want the thing that we, and especially you guys from European Union, already have. It's so, I mean, they're so retrograde. I mean, it's not avant-garde at all. It's not progressive, you know. They just want a good job, good life, something like in the West. They want freedoms. They want their women to be, you know, like without too many clothes. They want to vote. They want to go to the supermarkets. It's so non-punk, you know, to go to the supermarket or something. I mean, I grew up listening to the Clash. I'm lost in the supermarket, of course. But it's great to be lost in the supermarket when you already live in that kind of society. But if you're not living in that kind of society, the only thing that you want is a full supermarket and the money to buy things. And the job, of course. That's what you want. And that's what most of these people want. They don't want Islam. They don't want socialism. They don't want, I don't know what. They want to become the mainstreamest mainstream of the mainstream capitalist system of Western Europe and Northern America. Once they're in maybe third generation, second generation, they will maybe, you know, criticize that like we have now in the generations of immigrants in Western Europe. Somebody is turning to left, somebody is turning to Islamism or anything else, doesn't matter. But what these immigrants want is nothing of that. They don't want to be the other. They don't want to be loved or hated because they are the other. They don't want it. They want to be us. They want to be you. That's what they want. And I think that right-wingers for one sort of reason and the left-wingers for the other sort of reason are permanently non-seeing. It's a kind of a blind spot when you think about these people, their wishes, what they actually want. And it reminds me in Cold War times. It was a bit similar, of course, by totally different conditions. You had West and you had East, in political sense of the word, ideological if you want. And what happened? Many of people from the East wanted to escape to the West, and nobody from the West escaped to the East. But the West was full of great, impressive left-wing thinkers who had a serious problem with that. You know, because they defended the system they didn't live in. They lived in the West, they adored the East, they adored the difference, they adored the other. But the people who lived in that other didn't want other, they want same. They wanted that supermarkets and all these things who are basically not very, how should I say, very not impressive to us intellectuals. I will stop here because I think Igor will throw me out if I